Um, Hello, everybody, again. Oh, this is loud. Oops. Welcome back. Please take your seats. Lots of empty seats, lots of people standing. Please feel free to fill up all these empty rows. Welcome back to the Global Shift. We're now heading right into our third and last panel and section, which is about bridging the analog and the digital. And I would like to introduce our next keynote speaker. Very excited to have Paul Miller, aka DJ Spooky. He first caught my attention when I heard about him speaking about recycling as remixing and sampling rather than recycling. And I thought this was a very good idea and a very intelligent way of speaking about recycling, because recycling is always, in a way, attached to the notion of trash, which is bad. It always reminds us of trash and of waste. While when we start to speak about remixing or sampling, we start to use used materials as materials. And I think this is a very good idea and something that's totally needed and something that we should learn from the Global South. And on top of everything, Paul Miller says that this is a deeply, deeply African cultural technique, the art of remixing, which of course he must know because he's a DJ, hailing from New York. And I would like to just hand over. Thanks.
First and foremost, I just want to say, it's funny, I haven't done a PowerPoint presentation in years, and we actually had to, I bought an iPad and was planning on doing my whole presentation from both my phone and my iPad, but amusingly enough, the cables wouldn't talk to one another, and this is Italy, so we always have to improvise, which is also Italy, the Mediterranean aesthetic. So I have a new book out called The Imaginary App, and the reason I thought it would be resonant for this conference is that we live in an era where essentially information media and how we think about the idea of an information-based economy has shaped and molded almost all aspects of contemporary life. So what I want to do today is unpack some of the issues from the book and then think about sort of giving you guys a little bit of what I call thought tools about the way that design informs not only the ideology of what we like to think of as both tools, but dematerialization and the aesthetics of dematerialization. So when you think about an app, you're essentially touching a metaphor. And that's something that throughout this conference we've been seeing people talking about predominantly physical objects and predominantly images that tie together how we think about those objects. So if you think about a metaphor, there's a kind of a poetic situation at work. A metaphor essentially packs in several nuances and interpretations into something that can easily be kind of interpreted in radically different ways. So when you think of an app, you're essentially looking at a graphic design representation of a collision between code and culture. So what I wanted to do for this conference was not only talk about the idea of a global shift, but give people a sense of how apps and cell phones and mobile media and tablets have really radically reconfigured our ideas of not only mobile creativity, but how design itself has become this kind of notion of a user interface, a kind of the politics of perception and the way that sound and other kinds of more intangible media inform almost all aspects of contemporary life. So Richard Dawkins has a very famous phrase that I love to use for this kind of discussion, where he essentially says, science is the poetry of reality. And if we think about science in this era, as we move further into 2015, 2016, there's a kind of sensibility that many people are using devices that they don't know how they're either created or made. So say, for example, your cell phone has coltan batteries that are mined from mines in the Congo, which is in the middle of a huge civil war, which has dwarfed anything going on in the Middle East. Say, for example, Iraq or ISIS, what's been going on in Syria. You name it. But the batteries that drive most of our devices are taken from a metal that's been in the middle of a conflict zone for several decades now. If you think about Congo, it's kind of an eerie sensibility of both colonial aesthetics of appropriation, of taking of materials, but also the post-colonial kind of collapse of this idea of notions of failed nation states. So your cell phone is an emblem not only of the political ideology of capitalism, of mobile media, of dematerialization, but above all, how those materials come to be implicit in the device itself. Your average cell phone has materials from over 100 countries, and your average computer is using code that's usually derived from several open source languages and then packaged by a large corporation, whether it be IBM, whether it be Apple, whether it be Microsoft. So the pun here is that mobile media itself has come to kind of embody the tremendous collisions between post-colonial aesthetics and how we think about design as a kind of a very subtle but powerful force in changing perception. That is the metaphor of an app. So when Apple came out with Apple Maps, it's funny, when I was working on my book, I was doing research into failed projects of design. And Apple Maps was one of the best examples I felt really resonated with this idea of data glitch. And what happened with Apple Maps was when iOS 6 came out, Apple wanted to make a competing app for the design of routes, of optimization, moving between point A and point B. But Google had already mapped many tremendous amounts of parts of the world. So Apple was forced into a political kind of conflict with Google. And you can see the end result was these kinds of sort of non-linear landscapes made from the problems of gaps in data. And so the maps would try and put together these routes based on implicit gaps that information had not really been sort of what you call optimized. So the design here is that we're looking at not only a map that's actually incorrect, but you're also seeing the processes where data itself has had tremendous amounts of problem because it doesn't have enough of what you call a data set. So when I was working on my book, The Imaginary App, I wanted as much as possible to show and highlight this idea that there is no totalizing force in technology. And as a matter of fact, as we move further into the 21st century, one of my favorite writers is a gentleman by the name of William Gibson. He's a very renowned science fiction writer. He has a great phrase where he says, "The future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed." So because of the theme of this conference and because of the theme of not only Africa or the global south, but the idea that data itself is this kind of very powerful and tangible resource that informs the 21st century, there's still so many problems of how we interpret the data. So Apple Maps, great metaphor for that. So whenever you have your cell phone or whenever you have a tablet that's interacting with wireless network, you owe a thanks to this woman. Her name's Hedy Lamarr. And when I was working on my book, I was doing research into not only looking at the glitches between things like Apple Maps, as I was showing you earlier, but the hidden dimensions of invention, of how people had actually come to grips with some of the more pressing problems of how we thought devices would come out of the industrial and now post-industrial process. So during World War II, the Allies were in a bitter conflict with the Germans. There was a sensibility that the Germans were very far ahead in terms of math, and that informed the industrial process that was coming out of the German manufacturing of things like V-2 rockets and other encryption devices like the Enigma device, which was a device that the Allies couldn't crack. So modern computing comes out of the conflict of World War II and Alan Turing and Bletchley Park in the UK, but also people like Hedy Lamarr, who was an inventor who's uncredited. So during World War II, she invented this. It's what you now call CDMA, which stands for Code Division Multiple Access. This is the forerunner of Wi-Fi. So whenever you think about the idea of wireless networks, the idea that cell phones, Bluetooth-enabled devices, and other kinds of wireless-enabled devices, it all goes back to World War II, and the idea that the Allies were looking for better ways to outflank the Axis forces, which had better technology, better resources for optimizing math, and above all, they were able to use code to leverage a kind of sensibility that was very powerful. So the Allies couldn't crack the German encryption at the time, and Alan Turing, as we all know, became the father of modern computing. But Hedy Lamarr, as a woman inventor, worked with a composer named George Antheil to come up with this, which is essentially what she called a secret communication system. So amusingly enough, Wi-Fi, this is the beginning of Wi-Fi. In 1941, she filed a patent, and in 1942, the patent was accepted, but it never really was fully what you call vested. and eventually large corporations like Qualcomm and Intel inherited the patent for what we now call Wi-Fi. So she wanted to give the US government the ability to control torpedoes wirelessly. So we now have drones coming out of this invention as well, and your average cell phone is based on this patent from 1942. So when I was working on my book, I wanted as much as possible to look at the hidden variables that go into invention, and that's where design has a very powerful impact. If you think about this chart, it's a very specific chart relating to how an inventor would look at a legible surface and be able to manifest that in a graphic interface, whether it be before the invention of microchips, whether it was thinking about vacuum tubes and other things. But an inventor would be able to read this chart and be able to come up with a very specific schematic that eventually led to what we now have as Wi-Fi. But we're in a world that's kind of circumscribed by a gentleman by the name of Gordon Moore, and he has what they call Moore's Law. And Moore's Law essentially says that the power of computing doubles every 2 years. So you have to imagine your average cell phone has more computational power than the entire American space program of the late 60s, and your average cell phone will have more power literally in the next 2 years, and so on and so on. So Moore's Law of computing has taken us to the edge of quantum computing. And when you start thinking about what happens with quantum computing, that's what the imaginary part of my book comes into play. People haven't developed a sense of not only a linguistic differentiation between quantum versus mechanical senses of how people would manifest an invention, but again, design is one of those places where we're looking at not only how computational power is being applied to almost everything from architecture, genetic engineering, the manufacturing processes, you name it, but cell phones and tablets, as we've all seen, have radically changed in just several years. The iPhone came out in 2007. The first iPad was in 2010. Since then, there are more devices on Earth than there are people. And if you actually think about the short amount of time between 2010 and 2015, the next billion people to get online, which is pretty much coming up now, will be coming from places in the global south. Africa, India, Brazil, of course China. And if you think about those population densities, they'll be still interfacing with the design of a woman inventor from 1942 named Hedy Lamarr. So I love the idea that the beginning of modern computing comes out of not only the conflict of World War II, but these kind of hidden inventors, Hedy Lamarr, Alan Turing, who were kind of not what you would think of as the normal sense of someone who was looking at design as a tool that was meant to be making the world a better place. But one could argue it comes out of the conflict of the war. So modern computing is the stepchild of World War II. And when you see this idea that she was looking at creating a secret communication system, this becomes the modern basis not only for Bluetooth, what they call NFC and Wi-Fi, but the very basis for 4G and now 5G telephony. So my book explores these kind of issues from the viewpoint of not only like what I'm calling the imaginary possibilities at the edge of modern computing, but I wanted to give people a sense that what is the sense of irreverence and playfulness when you can't imagine the next step of where technology is going. So that led me to another kind of a sense of graphic design history. Behind me is a gentleman by the name of Alex Steinweiss. In the 1920s, record cover sleeves used to be blank. And he invented the modern record cover, as we know it. If you think about vinyl in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, you can see that the rise of the mass production of memory comes out of the idea that they put images on the record cover sleeve. So in the 1920s, record cover sleeves used to be blank. So Alex Steinweiss walked into Columbia Records and said, why don't we put an image on the record cover sleeve? And that became the modern basis for the record cover. But amusingly enough, if you think about the rule set here, there's a morphology at work that leads you directly to apps. And I'll go back for a moment to give you, think of this image, and we'll just go to this. And you can easily see that modern apps have inherited the same morphological sensibility as the record cover sleeve. So one of my favorite records is a piece by John Cage and Sun Ra, where they were trying to figure out how to make a record out of what you call chance processes. And if you think about what a computer is, it's essentially a collection of algorithms, a collection of command lines, and a collection where code has informed every aspect of the different roles that are being played out on the modern chips. But John Cage was considered to be the first composer for turntables, And in 1939, he wrote a composition called Imaginary Landscape that most people consider to be the first composition for wireless networks. It was a composition using radios and also record players. So you went into a room much like this, and there were a whole bunch of records that were skipping, and he had record like players going, but I also had radios playing empty spaces on the spectrum. So you heard static, you heard loops, you heard layers. On the other hand, Sun Ra was an artist who really was trying to figure out jazz and this idea of chance processes in composition. So I thought this would be a good place to think of the idea of an app coming out of this notion of chance processes and how people do the idea of selection, pulling elements of chance as not just how powerful those things can be, but what the role of a composer or designer is in the era of information overload. So this is one of the world's oldest songs. It's from Sumeria several thousand years ago, and amusingly enough, if you look at the top, this is a code that was meant to give you a specific sensibility of Sumerian compositional form, and they weren't able to translate it until recently. And these are a sort of normal, standard Western notation. So when I began my discussion by talking about the imaginary app, I wanted as much as possible to think of this collision between code and culture. So if you imagine several thousand years ago, if you walked into a Sumerian temple and you had people reading this and being able to come up with different music motifs and elements and being able to generate not only a compositional form, but a tradition based on that form, we can easily see that the tension between code and culture is now nothing but zeros and ones. And so is a song, so is an app. So in my book, I tracked down one of the people who invented one of the first glitch apps. And this is one of the most expensive apps ever on iTunes. It was $999.99, and it didn't do anything. As a matter of fact, the gentleman who invented it, Armin Heimrich, this was an app that was meant to display conspicuous consumption. So you would just have it on your phone, and it was meant to show that you were wealthy. It's called I Am Rich app, right? And it didn't do anything, but I thought it was kind of a funny place to begin a discussion of this idea of intangibility, conspicuous consumption, and the design of digital spaces. So if you saw this app on someone's phone, it was meant to be a status symbol, all puns intended. So if you think about what is a code versus an algorithm, they're basically reflections of one another. And this code is based on wealth. So Apple, at the time, wasn't sure what to do with it because it didn't do anything. And so eventually they took it down, and he then migrated over to Android. So I love this as a beginning of the imaginary app, as a kind of a sensibility of irreverence and fun, but also strangely tied to the real world wealth production processes. So can I ask everyone a quick question? How many have an iPhone? Just one, maybe 2/3. How many have Android, like what, Samsung or Nokia or something? Windows? Okay, smaller, 1/3. Any Windows phones? 1. Okay, 2, 3. All right. So these are ecosystems that have come out of the ruins of World War II. And if you think about the idea of telephony and the idea of how people were sending messages during the war, the idea was encryption was critical. And that's where, going back to Hedy Lamarr, this idea of a secret communication system to hold together the Allies' commands and routes between the war zones versus what the Germans were doing with the Enigma device. There's a really good film called The Imitation Game that just came out recently with Benedict Cumberbatch, the actor. And you can see Alan Turing struggling with this idea of encryption, and eventually modern computing comes out of the wreckage of that research. So with the I Am Rich app, I eventually curated a series of shows and exhibitions juxtaposing the idea of the record cover sleeve and the app. So we had this book launch at the London Museum of Design, and when you walked into the museum exhibition, you saw thousands of app covers that were meant to be reflections of record cover sleeves. And the only rule for the exhibition was that there had to be no function for the app. It had to be an imaginary app representing an app that did not exist yet. And so we had thousands and thousands of artists submit online, and it was a pretty fun situation. So people walked into the exhibition and were looking for familiar icons and logos. You'd see Dropbox, or you'd see Evernote, or you'd see Flipboard, or you see the Uber logo, or Airbnb. But once you started going through the exhibition, the graphic design process had led people to more and more unfamiliar spaces. As a matter of fact, in German, you just call it unheimlich. So the whole pun here was the imaginary app was a metaphor that was unspecific yet. And so you'd go into the exhibition and leave with a sense that you had all these apps you'd been exposed to, but you weren't quite sure of what the function was. So if we go back in time, this is 2015. And back in 1915, one of the first, I think it's now basically a 100 years anniversary, one of my favorite metaphors of this idea of the metaphorical becoming a contemporary art form is the Italian futurists. We're in Italy, so I'll just say it's called the Arte del Rumore. This was Luigi Russolo, who invented what they call intono rumore. And so they wanted to simulate the entire city in sound. So what ended up happening is they created the basic idea of the first sound system. And so if you think about 1915 until 2015, you can easily see who won, right? You can see these speakers here. And basically this was the original punk rock. You know, the audience would come in and they would start playing these instruments, and it was meant to be an entire city based on the spectrum of sound. So let's think about the John Cage, kind of reference there I was saying earlier. In 1939, his composition Imaginary Landscape was meant to simulate an entire city in frequencies, in spectrum. So if we think about how many waveforms are moving through this room, wireless networks, 4G, LTE networks, CDMA, 3G, 2G, and other kinds of frequencies that our modern civilization uses, amusingly enough, a Sumerian might not be able to understand that if you go several thousand years ago, and a normal Western musician might not be able to interpret those notes. But if someone had the right equipment, they would be able to make compositions out of it. They'd be able to generate factory spec cell phone materials and so on. So and it's not just a pun about the idea of the north-south divide here, but the way cell phones have transformed almost all aspects of how we think about the transference of information, how we think about social media, and above all, how we construct identity in this era of ubiquitous computing. So when you walked into an exhibition that was filled with imaginary apps, this was something that I felt would be a really fun but also irreverent sort of exploration of the ocean of information that we now inhabit. So the Italian futurists seem to get some things correct. The idea that dematerialization would be the sort of forerunner of how we think about not just the intangible spectrum of the city, the wireless networks, the sounds that simulate the everyday life, but the way that those things would inhabit the uncanny networks that hold the civilization together. So from 1915 to 2015, we can easily see an evolution of the avant-garde into the cell phone, the wireless spectrum of the imaginary spectrum. So when you think about these apps and cell phones as part of the basic idea of where people are thinking about the studio, that's something that comes into being, and my book explores that from the viewpoint of, I asked people like Bjork, who had an app called Biophilia. The designer of her app is in my book. It's called, his name's Scott Sneeb. We also tracked down the inventor of Google Maps. His name's Noel Gordon. And for the idea for the imaginary app was to have a book based on apps that would, the funny thing is, why would you do a book about an app anymore? You could just make an app about an app. You don't really need a physical 21st century book. But the Gutenberg idea of going back to 1542 when Gutenberg was exploring the idea of production of copies, the Gutenberg printing press is now the equivalent of the cell phone. In fact, your cell phone would have more computational power than several centuries of developments of printing. So when you do a book about an app, there's a paradox at work. And in fact, I celebrate that. So our modern sensibility is a semiotic relationship to the idea that apps are metaphors that you interact with, but they're not separate. Everything is connected. And the idea is that modern computing is strictly about the power and the leverage of networks. So as an artist and as a writer, my books are with MIT in the United States. MIT is one of America's premier technology universities. I wanted to figure out how an artist or a composer or an architect or a designer would respond to this idea that the studio is dematerialized. And if you think about, we're in a conference about design, if your studio is now kind of a series of wireless networks, linked to things like Dropbox, or if you're looking at volumetric projection, if you're doing your design, you don't need to be in one place. The geography, space, and time have all become very deeply tenuous. So what we're seeing here is, this is the basis of Google Maps. And basically, when I was doing the interview with Noel Gordon, who was the inventor of Google Maps, he said, Paul, this is where we made Google Maps. So getting from point A to point B, that's what it's all about. How do we optimize these issues and think of them as algorithmic processes that give people the tools they need to get to where they're going? And that's where I began this discussion showing you a glitch map of Apple iOS. So I developed my own iPad apps, and that's what led me to my book. Recently, we've had over 14 million downloads of my DJ mixing app. It's free on iTunes, but we also were at one point #4 on iTunes. And I was really intrigued to see how millions and millions of people were moving into this post-playlist aesthetic. The dematerialization of sound, going away from vinyl. For me, at least, as someone who collects vinyl, that was fun. And I want to give you a sensibility of this idea of the Photoshop imagination. This is Bush and Obama's face, Photoshop. You just line up the cheekbones, pretty easy. And the sensibility here is that the uncanny, the unheimlich, has both inherited what in the 19th century would have been called the Gesamtkunstwerk in German, but we're now moving more and more to this idea of ubiquitous computing as the basis for the modern imagination. So in the last 2 years, we've seen over 100 billion apps, now up to about almost 175 billion apps downloaded. But throughout several centuries, up until about 1960s, you'd seen only maybe 70 billion books bought and sold. So we're seeing this exponential rise in a new kind of literacy, the poetry of overload. And that's what I think modern design needs to respond to. So by way of ending, one of my favorite scientists is Einstein, and he was both a musician and physicist. And whenever he had a problem in physics, he would go play violin until he was able to kind of work the problem out. And he has a great phrase. He says, logic will get you from point A to point B. The imagination will take you everywhere. And by way of ending, I just want to say that's a book about paradox. So thank you very much.